Thank you. And good afternoon again. I'm Ray Billett. I'm the Judicial Branch Administrator. And I walk around a lot, so I'm going to get blinded. Anyway, in Maricopa County. And I'm very pleased to be here with you. Patty, my friend and colleague, we have done a lot of work and done some teaching in various components of the core. This one, the core on governance, is one that is very near and dear to my heart. I assisted in drafting the curriculum, and I actually think it's a very important topic. So what we're going to do today, and we know it's 3 o'clock, right? On the first day, and you're like, when does happy hour start? And Weinberg over here, he wants to know. But it's and that's what we like. And he's not a plant, but just a couple of things. What we're going to do today, you know, it's a two-part series. Part one is really about the essential elements, effective elements as we call it, about a court governance structure. And we're going to go through that with you today in the next hour. And we're going to give you a definition you can use. We're going to talk about the 11 principles of court governance that were drafted by then Chief Justice Durham and State Court Administrator Dan Becker out of Utah. Can I see a show of hands who've read those or may be familiar with them? If you haven't and you're really interested in governance, a good governance structure, that's one of the things we're going to recommend as a good reading for you. I know I have it. I keep it with me at all times when I talk about this. And the most important thing about this morning is we're going to talk about the roles of the key players in any governance structure. Now, we know in this room there's a varying group of people who are very small courts. So give me a show of hands who would say, my court's relatively small. And when you think of governance, what do you think about in your court? You and the PJ? You and someone else? So we understand it. And we understand there's people from very large courts that have more of a governance structure. But what we hope to do is give at least everybody something to take out of here that they can use in their home court. In their home court, yes. After that, then we're going to go to part two. And part two is this afternoon. It starts at 4:15. Is really about what we're talking about, that productive pair relationship between the chief executive officer and the chief judicial officer, and how that has a critical impact on the governance of your local court. And we'll spend a lot of time on that, giving you what we think are some good takeaway tools that you can use to build that productive pair relationship. So with that, I'm going to pause also, and the rules that Patty and I use are say anything you want at any time. Any question, please, as she said, give her an opportunity to bring the mic on. But we enjoy questions or feedback, comments. I'm going to ask you for some feedback, so be prepared. And so, because I like to see what you're thinking, because she and I, nor anybody in this country are not absolute experts on court governance. And the one reason is it takes different forms in different places and still can be good governance structures, even though it's not similar. So that's what we're going to do today, and we're going to start out with a little definition. And again, these are nothing, real deep, but basically governance is a framework, and I will stress framework with you, by which courts reach and communicate the decisions, establish business practices and activities, and develop long and short-term strategies. And the action verb behind that governance is really about planning. It's about providing direction. It's about providing leadership and strategy to the organization. And again, it's focusing on the big picture. Now, I'm well aware, as I referenced before, that's maybe a little difficult in some places, that you get down into the weeds on some things. And that's why we put in this next slide that says, basically, we're telling you what it is, and this is what it is not. It is not tactical management of the organization. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to pick on you, Ralph, because I love you. What do I mean by it's not tactical?
Well, tactical is everyday issues, everyday problems that come up that are routine.
Right.
It's not strategic, it's not visionary or broad.
It is not, as I just said, it is not big picture. So you need to guard against, in your governance structure, to guard against that. And as I said over here, as much as possible, the implementation of governance, a governance body decides we have a problem with drug addiction in our community. We're going to start a drug court. That's an action, that's a study it and review it, that's an action of a governance board. Putting that into place is not so much. Now, I also know that some of you may sit on that governance thing, turn around, and you go out and you become tactical. I get it, and I understand it. A lot of us do that. But for the most part, maintain the separation between those. These are kind of some examples that we just wanted to share with you about what are governance activities. As I mentioned, these are big picture items. Can anybody give me other types of examples of what you would use or what would be considered governance activities in your court?
Well, so I'll
go ahead.
I worked also at the trial court in Missouri, but then I worked at the state courts in Idaho. I used governance primarily for, not primarily, I often used governance decision making in the budget area when we were putting together our state budget request to the Idaho legislature. We had to make sure that we were making the best decisions and that we went through an organized process that we'll talk about in terms of governance. And then legislative priorities. What were our priorities going to be that legislative session? Those were two key areas of decisions that we had to be very thoughtful about, very definite about how we were going to make them, who was going to be involved in them.
Right.
So those were my two top priorities for use of governance decision making.
Just to back up just a bit, Patty and I were talking a little bit before, and I said to her, we've been in this business, as many of you have been in this business a long time, and when did we start talking about court governance? When did we start? I don't remember when I first started ever talking about governance of courts. I remember talking about court organization. How many of you gone through organizational changes in your state or local courts on how you're structured? And again, I came into this field in the early 80s, and I think it's really in that period, it was all about court organization. But what has happened is that we've gone through some reforms, and now we're talking about, well, how best do we govern that organization now? And that's why the issue of governance has become so important. And what is the other reason, by the way? And Patty's going to talk to you a little bit more about why it's so important. But what is one of the biggest factors that driving why we have to be governed well? That's one. In my mind, I'm thinking about, has the public's demands on us changed in the last 20 years? I mean, how many of us are, with the courts today dabbling in every piece of society, we now have to be accountable to the public on what we're doing in problem-solving courts and all those other areas. So it's important now for us as an institution to govern ourselves well. And so that's another reason why it's driving, and Patty will talk to you a little bit more about the need for that. I think I'm going to turn it back over to you, right?
So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some basic principles of court governance. And what's really cool is we posted...
Maybe talking in the mic.
You need to turn it on. Technical. Did you turn it on?
Did you? Yeah. Okay, all right. So,
wow.
So I forgot. Thank you. So we included on the website a copy of the actual court governance curriculum. And what's really cool, I think, about the NACM curriculum, and I'm a big fan of the NACM curriculum, whether it's on court governance or any of the others, is you can use it for a lot of different reasons, and you can use it in a lot of different ways. What we hope to do today is just acquaint you generally with the core curriculum on court governance. But one of the cool things is you can not only use it for just your own professional development to learn, what is court governance, what are the major principles, why is it important, etc. But you can also use this back in your court to share with others, to kind of teach your judges, to teach your leadership team, and share with them some areas that they might benefit from learning. And then you can also use it as sort of a self-assessment tool. You know, what are some good principles? What are some good practices? And what am I doing in my court that could be improved? So as you're listening to Ray drone on about something, be thinking about how you can really use it in your court, no matter big, small, state level, trial court level, it doesn't matter. Just think about, okay, so how are we making decisions? I simplify governance stuff into how am I making decisions? How are any decisions in the court being made? Who's being involved in them, etc. So as you look at some general principles, these are taken, and again, it's all included in your court governance curriculum, but these are taken from a series of articles and papers through the Harvard Business School or the Harvard Executive Series. And Chief Justice Durham and Dan Becker, as mentioned by Ray, wrote a couple of articles about court governance principles, and so these are all taken from them. But we thought it's really the foundation of good court governance and what are the essential elements. And so the first one is pretty self-evident, but a well-defined governance structure that works, that you have an overall definition and it's defined who's going to make what decisions, what is the governance structure. And I always say it's got to be in writing. You know, it hasn't always been that way. I mean, you go to a court, you live it, you breathe it, you try and figure out what the governance structure is, but it's not always in writing. And it's lore, it's, you know, it's tradition, etc. But one of the key elements is it has to be in writing, and it has to be published so we all know. Again, whether it's a small court with just a couple of 2, 3 people, or if it's a bigger court with 10, 12, you know, 100 judges, it just needs to be in writing. Another key governance principle is that meaningful input from all levels. So in my experience as a state court administrator, I needed to make sure that everybody had input, and the key is meaningful input. So were the clerks of the court involved in a particular decision? We had 2 levels of judges. Were magistrate judges involved in the decision? Were the district judges? Were the presiding judges involved? Did we encourage that feedback, that input, so that a decision, when it was being made, did involve everybody, and we were able to get that meaningful input. So always think about your decisions with that context. Was there meaningful input? I think this next one is the hardest. It's the hardest nut to crack, in my view. Ray, I don't know what your experience is, but that selection of judicial leadership should be based on competency, not seniority or rotation. That one is, I truly believe that that is a effective principle of governance. However, sometimes it's hard to crack the tradition that exists in a particular court or in a particular jurisdiction or statewide. Ray, what's your comment on that?
Well, I tell you, when I looked at this, I've never talked to Dan Becker or Justice Durham about this, but I look at this and I see the word competency, and I think we all then go, oh, that's the, great judge does his or her work, great at what they do, but that's not the competency I think as institutions we're looking for in judicial leadership. And so this, I agree, this is one of the most difficult ones we have. Yeah. I've worked in both systems. Yeah. Where but even the selection on competency was not so much how well do you how do you understand the principles of public administration and understand the workings of an organization and all those things. It's not that competency, it's more the legal competency. So that's an issue that is still with us today, and I mean, I don't see any end in that, but so it's a big issue.
Yep. The next one is on the commitment to transparency and accountability. And again, this is an essential element. When I first moved out to Idaho, 25 years ago, I would hear about, well, a lot of people didn't like the then Chief Justice. Well, it's just a black hole. You know, the governance body, we called it the administrative conference, might vote and recommend something, but it would just go into the black hole. And we never hear about what happened to that decision or that recommendation and what happened. And I'm sure in every court that happens to some recommendations that people make. If you're listening to your employees, they might have a particular recommendation or a thought or an improvement that needs to be made. Where does it go and what happens to it? And is there that feedback loop? Is there that transparency in decision making, where it goes, and then what happens, and then communicating it back out? With my black hole, I had to take really extraordinary steps to keep, the pending list and exactly what the status was of what decision, who had it, where it was, if it was getting reviewed by what group, whether the court had taken it up, whether they had tabled it for additional information to be submitted. But to really be focused on that transparency and accountability, you gotta follow that decision-making process all the way through and really be clear and open if something, gets stalled. Beyond your control, it happens. But we want to be, again, as transparent and hold ourselves accountable and our courts for effective and timely decision making. And of course, I'm only talking on the administrative side here. Anybody have a problem with a black hole? Is it just me? Yes, okay. A focus on policy level issues. You know and I know you could be making decisions all the time, one by one. That's what happens in some courts. Each individual personnel matter gets taken up, again, individually, or it has to go to the court, or somehow they're taken up one at a time. It's so important for us to think of effective governance on the policy. What's the policy involved distributing time standard reports, rather than taking it up on, who's requesting what public information. If we have a policy about the release of information, if we can think about things in terms of the policy for, again, the release of information or for the decision, no matter what the area is, that makes for effective governance rather than taking question by question up. And sometimes it's hard to really put your handle, really understand what's the policy at hand. But effective governance does suggest and really require that we think in terms of policy. And then the open communication on decisions and how they are reached. Sometimes that's really hard. When a decision is reached that either is contrary to what we think should have been done, and it really has, very difficult consequences on people. I can remember a decision that we had to make in tough budget times, and we had to recommend that judges were not going to get paid, you know, for the equivalent of a couple of days. That had never been done in our history. And it was a difficult decision to communicate, and why, and what about it. However, we communicated the best we could, explained all of our rationale, and really tried to give as much explanation and understanding that we could. And so, again, effective governance requires that we try to share and be very open about that information that we provide. Ray, you've got a funny look on your face.
No, I was just looking at these first six. That's often. Looking at these first six, I'm just interested from the group here, how many of you think your method of court governance is pretty well in line with these first six? Anybody? Nobody?
Yeah, I saw one.
Did I see one? I'm sorry. So is there some consensus or idea of these first six? And let's put the competent judicial leadership one aside for a moment. Of the remaining five, which do you find to be the most difficult to get in line with? Yes? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh. Other than that one. Any other ones really, oops, excuse me, I didn't mean to step on that. Any others really?
Get the microphone.
Address, here we go.
We got some back here.
Well, for us, we're a small court, but I'd say number one, a well-defined governance structure.
For Paul?
Do you have it at all? Or is it in writing or by tradition? Or
Well, when you start saying in writing, come on.
Yeah, that lets it go. Yeah, I agree.
And when you don't have something, then to start doing it when you've always been done by, well, this is the way it's always been, is a huge problem.
And it's a huge jump to go from, it's a huge jump to go from this is how we've always done it to starting to put it down in writing. And it doesn't just happen, you know, I mean, you just don't sit down and write it out. It's a deliberative, iterative process. So, but the important thing is to start thinking about it. We've all been in courts or worked in courts where it hasn't been well defined. And the important thing is to just get started, to just start thinking about any of these principles. And the cool thing, again, about the curriculum is that it gives you some great places to start. So there are also a couple of other principles that we wanted to talk about, and that is, and we'll talk more about it, but that there's really clear understood roles among those involved in governance. So what was my role as the state court administrator? What was the role of the Chief Justice? What was the role of, you know, a division director? Or when I was a trial court administrator, what was my role versus a judge's role versus a committee role versus my HR director, etc. What's important is that there is some clarity, and it's the same thing we talked about with having the overall structure. You got to just bring some clarity, and again, if you're coming in new or even if you've been there for a while, you begin to understand where there's a lack of clarity. And when there's a lack of clarity, that creates confusion, and where there's confusion, that creates conflict, and it just, you know, goes on and on. So again, one of the key principles of effective governance is to have that clarity in the roles roles and responsibilities. Of course, the next one is one of my favorites, trying to speak with one voice. We always talk about that at the state court level, but it is equally true in my trial court experience. When we speak with one voice, we're talking about, what are our priorities, what are we trying to accomplish, our goals, our objectives. We had to speak in terms of what are the priorities this session? Was it getting new judges? Was it adding behavioral health liaisons? Was it, getting a pay raise? That was always the priority, but anyway, excuse me. Whatever that priority was, I needed everybody who was communicating with the legislature to speak off the same script and to speak off and support that with one voice. Ray, what are some of the examples of speaking with one voice that you want to share?
Well, I think for me right now, it's really speaking to the legislature on issues, and we don't give them conflicting information about perhaps a new piece of legislation. And at the local level, particularly with the funding body, and when we talk about priorities as a court system, again, I have a very large system, and if I have multiple judges, leadership judges conveying different messages to our funding authority, what are they going to do? Probably not fund any of them. And so those are kind of two of the ones for me that are key when you have to speak with that one voice for the system. And it is a very difficult one because there are issues that are near and dear to individual judges' hearts on certain things, and we're all in this issue, and sometimes this time we have to spend our money over here and not on our issues we're dealing with children this time. And so it creates internal conflicts as well.
So there's three more just general principles I'll just touch on briefly, and that is the authority to allocate resources. Again, an effective governance system and structure permits you to allocate your resources fairly and equitably. And that you make the decision apart from your executive and legislative branches. Of course, there's always going to be constraints. There's always going to be line items and things like that. But that once the money is allocated to you, that you're really in charge of making those decisions. And then also the developing those relationships with other entities. An effective, well-governed system, a good principle, a solid principle of that is that we as the judiciary, as the court system, are going to really make every effort possible to foster that kind of warm, I don't know if that'd be the word, open, positive relationship with whoever our funding entity is. Sometimes it gets a little blurry in counties and sometimes in the cities, but the governance principle is that we are going to establish effective relationships. And then finally, again, that what we're doing as a court system, we really need to think about the core, the core, what are our core values, our core mission in terms of adjudication of cases. And that's most important. However, we keep pushing that. We keep pushing the boundaries of that. Kathy mentioned that I'm working on a national initiative to improve the court and community response to those with mental illness. Well, that's going beyond the core of our adjudication, but we're talking about the leadership role of the court system and how we can, in the court system, through our effective governance and through our leadership, really be that beacon in the community about what are some positive ways that we can make improvements. So again, think about that. We talk about why governance is important, and there's so many reasons. And again, your curriculum will give you some other ideas for it. But I always think about it in terms of, okay, to the public, we've got a responsibility to govern ourselves effectively. So from the public's perspective, we want to do it. From an internal perspective, I want our employees and our judges to know we are operating through an effective governance system. So from an internal perspective. And then of course there's other, to our funders. I want all of my funders to know how effectively we're governing ourselves. Who else needs to take a look at this? Why else is it important? All of our justice partners. If I'm working with the Department of Corrections, the Department of Health and Welfare in my community, I want them to know I'm running my business effectively, and I expect you to run yours effectively too, but more, I want them to know that we're doing everything possible and where we might need their help or where we might need to communicate with them. It's all about that independence of the judiciary, the rule of law. We want to demonstrate that. We're not going to do a whole course on procedural justice, but if we're letting people be heard, that helps with our governance. Does that cover? Are you good with those principles that we talked about? Are there any that you disagree with? We talked about which are the hard ones. Do you agree generally? I mean, can you accept and live that those are good principles to think about and to run our courts by? Yeah? Good. Great. Are there any missing? Are there any values or principles that, you think about a lot when you think about your court? Is there anything missing from that list? Anybody? I don't think there is. I haven't encountered what it could be, but I think it's important for us to always ask ourselves that. This list gives me enough to work on for another 30 years. If I could achieve all of these principles, and it's not a one and done thing. It's not, don't go home and, or think through this class, okay, I got those, It's not a one and done. It is a process, and you go through it all the time. I think about governance all the time. I think about how to improve it. I may put it on the back burner for a while, but maybe I'll flag it. Okay, think about it in a year. Let's see how the written policies are working on the governance. So bring it back up. Use this curriculum to do your self-assessment, to kind of talk to your judge or your judges, or to talk to your leadership team, and think about where you need to go with it. So I'm going to turn it over to Ray. We're going to talk a little bit about governance structures, which of course there's no one way to do everything. That's why the principles.
Well, that slide is done.
That's why the principles. That's why my part was so important.
On that previous,
we left you on that other stuff. Yeah.
On that previous slide, did any of you look at and say, what does governance have to do with procedural fairness? Did anybody say that? I don't know, because everything I do, ask my folks that I work with, procedural fairness is in there. I'll make it work, connect it somehow, to some way, those 4 components. But sometimes people say, wait a minute, what is this procedural fairness about? But supporting the issues of voice neutrality and trust within your organization. Anyway, so as Patty just said, and I've mentioned before, there is no one governance structure that we're going to stand here and tell you is the best model for a small court, medium, large, state, local, federal. They all vary in some size, although the federal courts are more centralized than in more of a one governance framework than the state courts are. And as I said, there's reasons for that. And when we're talking about what is, when you're looking at your governance structure, and those 11 elements were very, very important as you look at yourself and evaluate yourself. And Patty and I were talking, the first 8 of those, if you go back to those, are inward looking. how we as courts can do better internally. And then the last three are external looking to help you balance what you need to do. But anyway, in thinking about yours, your governance structure, and the one way or the best way for you to come up with it, these are three important areas that you have to focus on when you are addressing those factors within your local court system. So let me just pause there. So who wants to volunteer and tell me what their governance structure is? Is it you and the PJ? Presiding judge, chief judge? Raise your hand. Believe me, I did. No one else, no other leadership judges? No?
Not usually.
Not usually? It varies? It varies by issue?
Issue.
Okay. Others, who else raised their hand? What is that your structure, and is that understood throughout your organization, that that's how decisions are made that impact the organization with the administrator and the presiding judge or the chief judge? Who has councils or executive boards that they work with? Judicial executive boards. Anybody?
Yeah.
Talk to me about your structure. Tell us.
Wait.
Oh, sorry.
There's several judges on a board along with our court administrator. So a group of 7 to 8 judges at a time.
And those judges are selected?
It's usually the supervising judge of the different departments, such as civil, family law.
Okay.
And then a couple of 2 random judges.
Two
Random.
at large?
Yeah.
That's much better.
Anybody else want to
yeah.
share? How do you? Yes, sir. Go ahead. Over here. Sorry, we're making a run. She's getting her exercise back and forth.
Yeah, the marathon queen.
Oh, yes, she is a marathon runner, too. That's right. So the next question, come over in that corner. Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm Dana Friend from the D.C. courts. We have a joint committee on judicial administration. So there's we have the Court of Appeals. There's the chief judge of the Court of Appeals, judge also associate judge from the Court of Appeals, and the chief judge. And so they actually make the policies for the courts. And then we have judges that sort of preside over things like criminal.
Yeah.
We have presiding and deputy presiding that all work closely with the chief judges.
How many of you use what I'll call not a judicial, but a court leadership executive committee comprised of non-judges and department administrators? Just, you do?
We have that meeting once a quarter, but
What's
they
the,
don't decide on the issues.
what is the purpose of that group?
Just to discuss different things that are.
I'm sorry. She's going to hit me because I always do this. I never wait for her. I'm sorry, Kat.
We just discuss different issues that might be going on around the courthouse, like when the DA schedules murder trial, murder trial, murder trial, murder trial. So just issues like that.
A lot of murder we hear. Who? Someone else over here raised their hand, said they were using, yes, you have an executive component? Thank you. She's a trooper.
We do. It's not defined officially as an executive leadership, but it's what we call our operations committee. Has the presiding judge, and then all of the court managers and supervisors. So we meet every other week and go over policies that need to be changed, updated procedures, new legislation, and just general operational issues. And then we distribute. We have like a 3-tier communication process from that. We send out an email to staff. We send the agenda and minutes with the supervisors when they have their staff meetings. And then when we have a general staff meeting, we kind of open that up for Q&A for staff to ask us questions.
In my case, I have both a judicial executive committee at the top and a judicial leadership at the top, and then a court executive committee. And I use that court executive committee for 2 things. One, to push ideas and thoughts up for consideration. And 2, once decisions are made, that's the group that takes that and deploys whatever decision is made into the institution and make it work. So kind of a 2-way of using executive committee. Anybody else want to share their governance structure, how they make decisions in their court?
There we go.
Where? Please. Is anyone here from the federal court before you, by the way? Anybody here from the federal courts? You are? DC's funded by Congress, I know. I was good friends with Dwayne. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Thank you. So we have what's called the executive committee, comprised of leadership judges, starting with the presiding judge, and within each court division we have chief judges, so criminal chief judge, family chief judge, and civil chief judge. And then we have one at-large judge membership from the rest of the judges, and then the trial court administrator and the deputy trial court administrator. And in this forum, it's mostly a group decision-making, idea-bouncing session focused at judicial activities and some operational issues, but that are really broad. And so nitty-gritties of operations are not really discussed here, really more of a high-level discussion. And we have this meeting once a meeting or as an ad hoc as needed. And it seems to work out really well for us.
Well, as you can hear, there are varying ways of governing in your court, and you have to find the one best way that fits your needs. So I know I've got the eyeball from the boss over there. I got to get moving. Excuse me. So in that curriculum, and that was part of the. They have electronic access to the curriculum, right?
Yeah,
okay.
It's posted.
All right, in your curriculum, and we're not going to go through these in great detail, but if you really want to take a look and you're interested in improving your governance in your court, or even just doing a little test, if you will, assessment of your governance structure, there is some material in the curriculum that will take you through what is termed the framework for success, evaluating the commitment. How many right now think your judicial leadership is committed to good governance? Absolutely committed.
Yeah.
It's not all of you.
Yeah, great.
It's a big issue, and so that's why it's on there. And there also within the curriculum, there is a readiness test you can take yourself and give it to some others in your court to really see where you are on the scale of, yeah, things look pretty good, and maybe we should start seriously talking about improving our governance, or no, we've got some serious issues, and these are the issues we have to identify and work on first. And so, but I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but they are in your curriculum, and I wanted you to know they're there for your use in the event you're looking to take a serious, hard look at how you govern in your local court system. So we're going to spend the last few minutes here just on the key players and any governance. And you know, when you think about your presiding judge, let's start there. What is your presiding judge's role in the governance of your court? What do you want them to do? By the way, do I have any presiding judges here? Huh? What do you want them to do as the top leadership judge in your court and functioning at the head of the governance? What do you want that person to do?
I want them to talk with me before they make any decisions.
She's a micromanager.
No. I just am a big believer in that top executive leadership team.
Right.
And I think the presiding judge and the trial court administrator should be a team and should be involved in team decision making. So I mean it, and it's not that I'm a micromanager. Take that back.
I know. I mean, for me, again, everybody's different, and obviously you want to be part of a team to make a decision. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But don't you want them to be a strong, visible advocate for what that body is doing?
Yes.
Because remember, they're talking to peers, and what do we always say? A chief judge is nothing but a first among equals. Is that what we call it?
Yeah.
Mark?
Yeah.
Chief, yeah. And so you need that body, that person, that judge to be a strong advocate for what you're doing in the governance area. You also, obviously, and many of us have had the same presiding probably for a long time. Me, I'm starting number 10 in August. And always, there's a change, even though they don't change everything, there's always a change in what is important to them, right? And so you need for them to be clear with your governing body. What is their priority? Now, in Arizona, every Chief Justice does a strategic plan, and they can come out with their priorities. And so you know where they want to go. And so it's important for that. Again, no one else like a presiding judge can convene stakeholders, can they? If a presiding judge is willing to take those steps to get that district attorney or whatever you call them in your district at a meeting, can they do it better than you? Probably. So that's an important role for them to be that convener of people you may need to have discussions with. And also, it depends on, everybody's different. I like to call them a coordinator of decision making. Not always the ultimate decision maker. Because you're dealing, and we'll talk about this, the complexity of our organizations, courts, is what? They're all the same. And a presiding judge cannot tell you what to do as a judge, can he or she? Can't. I mean, in most jurisdictions they can't. They can assign them a calendar, they can put them in a courtroom, but can they say, hey, by the way, we're going to adopt time standards and you will do it? What's going to happen there? You know, we all probably been through that a lot. Well, some will say, yeah, it's a great idea. Others will say, no way. I'm an independent judicial officer. It doesn't say anything in there that I have to do that. And so, anyway, so for me, I like, in my preference in PJs, is that person who can convene and really collaborate and coordinate a decision. Not so much just saying, here's the decision, which is what we're going to do. There are times for that, but to be the convener of it. So you want to talk about the leadership team anymore? Or?
Well, so that, whether it's the leadership team or the role of the executive.
I actually talked about that a couple of times.
Yeah,
let's just take the court administrator.
The role of the court administrator, again, I have the court administrator right there with the presiding judge working as that executive leadership team. And they have to communicate with one another about whatever the decision is, about whatever the information is. I think of them as jointly responsible for the overall governance system and what's going on, whether it's working with all of the judges or all of the staff, or whether you have probation or not. The court administrator is also responsible for implementing a lot of the decisions, and there I don't need my presiding judge right there with me. Once my presiding judge and I as the court administrator have reached whatever the policy decision is through whatever process of people that need to be involved, then I as the court administrator can implement it. I can implement it with all of the judges, whether it's all the judges in my court or whether it's all the judges statewide. But then I see that role of being the implementer and making it effective. I want to talk a little bit about the role of standing committees too. And when you think about your court, and again, it depends on size, it depends on your needs, but most of our courts that I've ever been in and served in, I've needed a few committees to work. I mean, I used to joke that any day I wasn't appointed to a new committee was a good day, but sometimes there were too many committees and subcommittees, and they would blossom, and go on and on. But truly, we do need to engage others. It might be that we need to engage a multidisciplinary group, that it's not just judges and court administrators talking about a particular issue. I may need to involve my behavioral health people, or I may need to involve community members, or I may need to involve attorneys. So there may be a need for you to have different standing committees. What are some of the common committees that you do have, that you work with in your courts? Name off a couple. We won't make Kathy run up. Name a couple. Security is a great need to have that typically as a standing committee, because so many issues are coming up. What's another committee? Technology, again, that's an excellent example. We always have to have, I think, a committee to help identify the priorities, help identify what we need to be working on next, and setting off those priorities. Any others? Huh?
Case flow.
Case flow committee is another great committee. And some of them, again, I always distinguish between what's a standing committee that you're just going to have for a couple of years versus what might be a short-term committee, a task force, or just to implement this new legislation or implement this new shorter-term provision. So when you think about your governance structure and those key elements that are in key roles, think about the committee structure that you have, that you have an ongoing need for, and think about using shorter term committees so that they just don't, nobody needs more meetings. And so you want to use your time and the judge's time as wisely as you can. So maybe it's just a short-term thing. For 90 days, you're going to put this group together to try and accomplish this objective. And whenever I'm starting new committees or short-term, task force, whatever you want to call them, I'm always, as a part of effective governance, making sure that I'm clear in terms of what's my deliverable? What's the charge of that committee? What do I want that group to accomplish? What are the timelines? When do I want my report back or my recommendation back? And who's going to be on that group? And again, effective governance suggests that should be in writing. Just again, a clear, simple charge of the committee, then who's going to be on it, and when you want whatever recommendation back to you.
So really quickly, and I just want to make a point, because we did talk a little bit earlier about the roles of the leadership team and the executive team. But the other important function those two groups play, remember, they can be champions for whatever the governance action just took, whatever change is coming down. Those can be, from the judicial leadership team, can be champions with their colleagues, and the executive team champions with their employees. And that's the other thing we try to do anyway, is push those through so they become, the people out there talking about why this is a good change, why this policy we just adopted is good for us. So let me stop there. I want to ask you one question first. So when you decided to come here, you may have had one or two things in your mind that, hey, this is what I want to hear about. Did you hear them? And if not, ask the question. Please do. Well, that's good. Okay, so you heard what you wanted to hear. Now, do you have any questions? Yeah, do you have over here? Go ahead.
So I feel safe asking the question without presiding judges in the room, but how do you typically handle the conflict between the court administrator and the presiding judge? Come to next session.
There are two tools we're going to teach you about: role negotiation and decision charting, which will alleviate, will never eliminate, it will alleviate much tension in your world with the presiding judge. And this is something I've done I never knew what it was called till one day somebody put it in, and I think, hell, I've been doing that. So you sit down and you talk about, in this fashion, in a safe environment, all right, the budget. How many of you in this room have final say over the budget? And your presiding doesn't? Congratulations. But just things like that, when you walk in, sometimes, I did in my former job back east. I walked into the job in Arizona. I'm like, what? Why does... But again, I'm not criticizing that decision. I'm just saying it was different, and we needed to go through that role negotiation and charting stuff. So, but I hope you come. So, yes?
You just raised the question of how many have final say over the budget.
Yeah, it's just an example.
I know it's just an example, but in certain jurisdictions, the rules of court govern.
I know. We'll talk about factors that influence that. And not only rules, but statutes in some locations. Right, Rolf? We have statutes for everything in Arizona. So, but that's an excellent point. And that's part of the environment you have to understand when you do this role negotiation. And decision charting. Anybody else have questions for us?
Well,
if not, we thank you very much for attending.
And remember to take home your curriculum for self-assessment, for teaching, for sharing. There's a lot of great stuff in here, so we hope you will take advantage of it.
And
thank you.
Segue into the next part for those of you that aren't staying. You mentioned that this is part 1 of part 2. Please rate this session on the app. There will be a rating for session 1 and session 2 because it might be different participants. So please, if you're not staying, or even if you are staying, please rate session 1 so it has a rating. Also, as far as on the app, we talked about the curricula being on there. There's all the PowerPoints are there too. So anybody that's not familiar with the app, you can have the PowerPoints of the presentation are available through the app. Not just for this session, but for all sessions. So thank you, Ray and Patty. Thank you very much for coming.